Good evening. My name's Brian Pakpour. I am a family law attorney in California, in Davis, California, to be specific. I've been practicing family law for 8 years, and I have been just checking to make sure this is recording. Um, I've been a family law attorney for 8 years. I've been practicing law for 8 years. I've practiced primarily family law and I'm also a certified family law specialist under the California State Bar's rules for becoming a specialist in an area of law. So I've qualified for that. I'm also a managing partner of a law firm called Pakpour Banks, LLP. We're in Davis, California. And you see my website there. We also have a I have a Twitter account and a TikTok account. I encourage you to go to my TikTok account. I leave videos there daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, explaining various family law issues and answering questions. So I encourage you to visit the TikTok link that is below. So we're going to talk tonight about domestic violence and specifically um, the uh, what domestic violence is. Tomorrow, or I'm sorry, in another section to come very soon, we're going to talk about what the procedure is for requesting a domestic violence restraining order. And then we're going to talk about how to complete a domestic violence restraining order and how to prepare for court and how filing a domestic violence restraining order and how the court finding that domestic violence has happened affects the rest of your family law case. So I want to back up a minute here and just show you that nearly 20 persons per minute are abused by an intimate partner in the United States. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and/or stalking. And intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime in the United States. Domestic violence causes family breakups, and it also has an effect, legally speaking, on child custody orders, spousal support, and sometimes, in limited circumstances, even property division in California. So when I reference the law in this presentation, just to give you a heads up that I am specific to California law. I'm licensed to practice law in the state of California and in no other jurisdiction. So I cannot give you advice on how to practice law in any other state. Um, the Sometimes I do give out general advice about things like parenting plans, etc., but I cannot give you specific legal advice about how to operate in a state other than California. So, as I said before, tonight we're going to talk about what domestic violence is. So, what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is defined under the California Family Code as abuse against one or more of the following people. So, before we get to the definition of abuse, let's just focus real quickly on who can ask for a domestic violence restraining order. So, in order to request a domestic violence restrainer, and there are several kinds of restraining orders, by the way, in order to request a domestic violence restraining order, you have to be prosecuting one of these against one of these people that I'm going to go through. So, a spouse or former spouse, that should be pretty obvious. A cohabitant or former cohabitant. So, just to be clear on that one, this rarely comes up. I've actually had this come up in 2 cases before where the individuals lived together as roommates, but they had no other relationship. It was a very loose friend of a friend type of cohabitant situation. There was no intimacy between the parties, etc. And there are some circumstances where you might be living with someone but not really a quote unquote cohabitant as far as the law is concerned. So check that before you use a domestic violence restraining order against someone who is possibly just a roommate. But again, it's a rare circumstance, but it does happen. A dating partner, again, that should be pretty obvious. A co-parent, that of course anybody you share children with. And then these people, so anybody within they call this the second line of consanguinity. So this would include parents, siblings, children, grandparents, grandchildren, uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, and half siblings. So any of those individuals, if those individuals abuse you, and we're going to talk about what abuse is, but if any of these people do that, you can request a domestic violence restraining order as opposed to another kind. Usually the alternative in California is what's called a civil harassment restraining order. I'm not going to get into detail about civil harassment restraining orders except to say that they are more difficult to get, and that is why it is best to qualify for a domestic violence restraining order if that's what you want, because they're easier to get. But you have to share one of these relationships with the person you're getting it against. So, say for instance, you're asking for a restraining order against a neighbor who you do not have share children with or have any kind of intimate relationship with. Or familial relationship with, you could not use the domestic violence restraining order process. You would have to go through something like a civil harassment restraining order to get the kind of relief that you're seeking, which are a little more difficult than domestic violence restraining orders. So now we'll talk about what specifically abuse is. So abuse has several definitions. It can be intentionally or recklessly causing bodily injury, placing one in fear of immediate bodily injury. In other words, for instance, like running to hit someone and stopping just short of your fist reaching their face, that would also be abuse. Sexual assault, of course. And then here's a whole list of things: molesting, attacking, striking, stalking, threatening, sexually assaulting, battering, credibly impersonating, falsely impersonating, harassing, destroying personal property, or disturbing the peace. Out of the first three that you see here are pretty obvious. I don't think I need to talk about any of those. Out of this more larger section of categories, I would say the ones that come up most often, that are useful to know about, are the destroying personal property, harassing, and disturbing the peace. Those three come up quite frequently. The ones before that are pretty obviously domestic violence: attacking, striking, etc., stalking, threatening. Those are all domestic violence. Um, the thing to remember, and we'll get to destroying one's emotional or mental calm, but the thing to remember and I get this quite a bit in my practice, is somebody will say to me, "Well, they never physically abused me," and I'll say, "Well, obviously as a lawyer, I want my case to be as easy as possible, and physical abuse is the easiest abuse to oftentimes, it's the easiest abuse to prove. And then, of course, if you're able to prove it, it's easy to get a judge to see why a restraining order is necessary. However, it's not required. In fact, I would say at least half of the domestic violence restraining orders that I've obtained involved no actual physical abuse at all. Maybe a tugging of some kind, but nothing like you would think in the more severe cases like punching or scratching or something that would actually leave scars or some kind of injury that you would record. So it's very common that you would not involve physical abuse, and anytime and the court can't require that you make some kind of prove some kind of physical altercation. So as I said, there's some new categories in California for abuse, and it'd be interesting to see if these permeate through the other 50 states. But one of them is called destroying one's mental or emotional calm, which is similar to disturbing the peace, as well as coercive control. Now, coercive control, the legislature here in California actually expanded on that definition, and we'll talk about that next. But this was passed by the California legislature last year and signed by the governor last year, and goes into effect here in 2021, to address what is a very common form of domestic violence that is very, very hard to prove. And even when you prove it, the judges have a difficult time seeing why it needs to be that it's conduct that needs to be restrained. And I think a lot of people watching this will probably find this type of behavior familiar. So we'll talk about that coercive control. So the legislature defines coercive control as a few things, but it's not limited to these things. Isolating from friends, relatives, or other sources of support. That's a very common thing I get. People in my office, especially women, who say, I'm not allowed to see my friends, I'm not allowed to call my family, and he controls all the money. I have to ask him every time I want to go grocery shopping. He'll give me exactly what I need to go grocery shopping and no more. Depriving of basic necessities, controlling, regulating, or monitoring movements, communications, daily behavior, finances, economic resources, or access to services, compelling by force, threat of force, or intimidation, including threats based on actual or suspected immigration status, to engage in conduct from which the other party has a right to abstain, or to abstain from conduct in which the other party has a right to engage. So oftentimes that's some kind of blackmail, and I see that a lot in my practice. I see people threaten the other person with, some kind of immigration punishment, or I'll tell your family, and they might have they might be in a culturally conservative uh, religion or culture from a country that embraces that, where if someone was to disclose some kind of behavior, it would cause great shame for them. And so that is a form of coercive control. There's a lot of things that could fall into it. And the legislature was very clear to say that this isn't an exhaustive list. In other words, there could be other ways of doing it, but the legislature wanted to give examples to the judges, who are the ones who have to interpret the law and apply them to the cases that come before them. And so they gave these examples, but they also said it wasn't limited to these. So the idea through all of these definitions is to really help individuals figure out what is abuse. And domestic violence specifically, and I had a judge recently say, and I agree with this 100%, say recently here in Yolo County that it really shouldn't be called domestic violence, which is what we call it here in California. It really should be called domestic abuse, because violence is a word that judges misinterpret to mean something like, I have to see physical violence, I have to see scars or damaged property or something like that. And you don't need to have that. It's really domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse, that we are trying to address, that the legislature is trying to address. And all of that has to do with control, which is why I think they came up with this new category, because there are a lot of smart abusers out there. They're not going to physically abuse, they're not going to leave scars. They are going to do the other things that they can, that they won't get caught for, that nevertheless control the other person in a way that causes them incredible emotional trauma that the legislature wants to protect from. So we're going to go through a couple of examples, and what I hope to, I guess, shed some light on with these examples is what domestic violence is and what it isn't, because it is sometimes confusing for my clients when they come and talk to me about domestic violence. And I think it's really important that we understand exactly what it is and what it is not. So I'm just going to read through example one, and it might, some of these facts might seem familiar to some people, and these facts are really ripped out of cases that I've had in the past. They're a little bit of a combination of different stories that I've heard from clients in the past. So Wanda came back from the bathroom to find her husband Vision holding up her phone in the hallway. "Who is Tony?" Vision demands in a loud voice. "I work with him," that's Wanda said. Vision's face becomes tense. "He texted you, quote unquote, 'Thanks, I had a great time.' What the hell is that about?" Wanda got scared. This wasn't the first time Vision raised his voice to her. "There was a birthday party for him last night, and I didn't get to go, so I sent him a message saying I hope his party was fun." Vision was furious. He cornered Wanda in the hallway, preventing her from leaving. Their sons, Thomas and William, were in the next room and came running to their mother's defense. "Daddy, please stop yelling at Mommy," they yelled. Give me the passcode to your phone right now, Vision yelled at Wanda. Please stop yelling in front of the boys, Wanda pled. If you give me your passcode, you won't have to worry about that. That's what Vision said. Wanda was scared, so scared that she forgot her passcode. By now, Vision was irate. I bought this phone, so it's mine. He threw the phone down the hallway where it just missed hitting William before it crashed into the wall, cracking the screen. What, if any, acts of abuse transpired? So let's go back to the beginning just to see. Uh, uh, so, Wanda's back from the bathroom and Vision's holding up her phone. Not really any abuse coming up there. Um, but you could start to see the beginnings of coercive control here, where he's demanding to know who's texting her and what it was about. In and of itself, is this abuse? Probably not. But if he did it a lot, if he was constantly checking her phone to see who she was talking to and constantly questioning who she was talking to and demanding to know who she was talking to, under the new definition here in California of abuse, this could in itself be considered an act of abuse. Would I go to court on this act alone? Probably not. I'd probably tell my client this isn't enough. It's going to be, time consuming and expensive, and to see if you win on something like this alone. So now we see that, Vision's raising his voice and she's trying to explain the text message. The kids are now witnessing the event and they're begging their father to stop. So here, this is, obviously one of the biggest effects of domestic violence is the effects on the children. Domestic violence that takes place in front of the children is typically considered much worse than domestic violence that does not take place in front of the children. And that's because of just the wholesale effects that has on a child's well-being. It also has an impact, and we'll talk about later in future parts, not tonight, but in future parts, we'll talk about how you can ask in a restraining order for the restraining order to protect other household members or to protect the children. And when you do that, you have to provide additional facts to explain why it should protect the children, not just the parent asking for the restraining order. One of the facts that you would typically list is that the violence took place in front of them. Obviously, if the violence happened to them as well, say for instance, the uh, one of the parents hit the children, then that's pretty easy to understand why they should be protected as well. But any fact that goes to the children witnessing the acts, themselves probably being scared from doing so, would the give you the cause to ask the court to protect the children as well as the person asking for the restraining order. So again, to give me the passcode to your phone right now, yelling it at her, and this uh, this is, again, this is along the lines of that coercive control. Wanda's begging him just to stop yelling, and obviously it's scaring Wanda, him raising his voice. So when he says to her, "If you give me your passcode, you won't have to worry about that," that's kind of a threat, right? He's saying, "Well, I'm going to keep scaring you. I'm going to keep putting you and the boys in fear unless you give me your passcode." So now he's literally threatening her and in some ways blackmailing her. The only way to get out of the fear, the only way to get out of this incident, this confrontation, is to do what I want. That's control. Um, and of course, Vision got really upset. He told her he bought the phone and he threw the phone down the hallway where it just missed William and crashed into the wall, cracking the screen. So here we've got a couple of acts of abuse that what we referenced before. One, of course, is throwing the phone and almost hitting William with it. Obviously, that caused William some fear, seeing a phone, assuming this is some kind of like an iPhone or a Galaxy or something like that. That's to hit a kid with that. It would hurt a lot, and it would scare a kid to see that flying past their head. And so that would be domestic violence against his child. And then of course it crashing into the wall, cracking the screen. That is destruction of personal property, or breaking personal property. That in itself is an act of domestic violence. And I gotta say, out of all the acts of domestic violence, this is one of the ones that I see the most. The destroying of the phone. I can't tell you how many destroyed phones have become the key piece of evidence in a domestic violence case. It just happens all the time. And quite often it's the boyfriend saying or someone's paying the phone bill, usually the boyfriend or the husband saying, "Well, I pay the bill. I can take this phone. I can break this phone. I can do what I want." Well, when you do that, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, of course, is it's that it's that person's phone, so they're the ones depending on having that phone that you're destroying. So that's a problem. Number two, if Wanda was to want to call the police, and this is where it really gets serious for family court, she can't now. You just broke her phone, or you took it away from her. In either case, now she can't call the police. Now she cannot call for help. And that's a serious, serious problem that the court would be very worried about. So that in and of itself, I I've joked around with colleagues before because I've had a couple cases where the phone was taken. Again, it's a common thing. And I had a guy one time on the stand. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to prove the case. There wasn't a lot of facts to go on, but I had him on the stand and I said, "Well, isn't it true that you took her phone?" And he's like, "Well, yeah, I took her phone, but that was to get her just to get her to stay and talk to me. Of course, I was going to give it back to her." The judge kind of looked at me and gave me this funny look because we both kind of shrugged our shoulders and said, "Well, the case is pretty much closed at that point. That was domestic violence. The whole point, you just admitted that the point of what you did was to control the other person. I took her phone so she would stay and talk to me. You cannot do that. That's domestic violence. If she wants to leave, that's perfectly fine." And by the way, I've seen women do the same thing, take a guy's keys or take his phone because no, we're going to talk about this relationship, or we're going to talk about the kids, and he would never talk to me, and this was the only way I could get him to talk to me. You can't do that. It's literally domestic violence, and it happens very frequently. I'm always shocked by it, but it does happen very frequently, and those acts in and of themselves are enough to get a domestic violence restraining order quite frequently. So we talked about example one and all the different acts of abuse in there. So we'll talk. We have one more example, and then we'll close for this portion of my domestic violence presentation. So Wanda and Vision's relationship has been teetering for some time, and Wanda hoped the recent birth of twin boys would be a wake-up call for Vision to take his relationship with her seriously. Instead, Vision stopped coming home some nights, getting drunk, and started having an affair with Natasha, a girl Vision works with that he constantly told Wanda she was crazy to be suspicious about. Vision moved out of the apartment he shared with Wanda and into Natasha's apartment. Wanda was furious and sleep deprived, caring for twins 95% of the time by herself. Vision promised Wanda he would be to her apartment every night after he got off work to give her a break caring for the newborns. He also promised to assist her with paying the rent on the apartment since they were both on the lease. 10 days into the month, and Vision hadn't given Wanda money for rent. He also stopped showing up consistently to help Wanda with the twins. It was 8 p.m. on Thursday night when Wanda had enough and charged over the apartment Vision shared with his new girlfriend, with the twins asleep in the back seat. Instead of knocking when she arrived at the apartment door, Wanda barged through the unlocked door and demanded to know what was going on. Natasha told Wanda to get out. Wanda, holding the knife in her hand, demanded to know where Vision was. Natasha told Wanda she didn't have to tell her. Wanda picked up a snow globe from a nearby shelf and threw it through the glass coffee table, which was 2 feet from where Natasha was sitting, spraying glass everywhere. Wanda then left the apartment. Seeing Vision's vehicle in the parking lot, she used the pocket knife to gash a hole in all four tires. She then got in her vehicle and went home. What acts of domestic violence took place? So again, like we did before, let's go back to the beginning. Um, so this last line, there is this whole part about Vision, the girl that Vision works with, Natasha, that Vision works with, said that she was crazy to be suspicious about. There is a growing consensus throughout the family law profession to start thinking about gaslighting as an act of domestic violence. And some professionals are starting to do that, or at least presenting it as one act. If all anyone ever did to somebody was gaslight them, would that be domestic violence? Probably not. It would have to be one of the most serious acts of gaslighting ever. So I I caution anyone to bank their case on an act of gaslighting. However, if you're already got stuff like physical abuse and destruction of property, and you want to throw gaslighting in there, go for it. It may very well work. Um, so, is that an act of abuse? Maybe, but it would be difficult to prove. So he moves out of the apartment. Wanda obviously is not completely in her right mind, given that she's sleep deprived with twins that no one's helping her with. And Vision made all these promises to her, and he hasn't done that, and so she's broke, she's sleep deprived, and she's healing from the breakup of a relationship and finding out that her husband or the father of her children has been having this affair. No acts of abuse really taking place here. Um, then, of course, Vision didn't give Wanda the money, stopped showing up, and so Wanda goes over to the apartment that Vision now shares with his girlfriend, Natasha. So obviously, when Wanda barges through the unlocked door into a home that she is not a tenant of and demanding to know what is going on, um, Vision himself, at least according to this fact pattern, isn't there. So you can't really call it an act of abuse against Vision just doing that. But Natasha might be able to. But remember, we talked about the relationships you have to ask for a domestic violence restraining order. Natasha and um, Natasha and Wanda do not share one of those relationships. She is the girlfriend of a co-parent and former romantic partner, but she is not herself related to Wanda. Natasha is not herself related to Wanda in that way. Um, so Natasha tells Wanda to get out. Wanda, now she's holding a knife in her hand and she's demanding to know where Vision is. I think that would most people would consider that a threat. You know, if you're holding a weapon, even if you're not waving it at somebody or pointing at somebody, the fact that you're holding a knife, which is not a normal thing to do, someone just walking around with a pocket knife in their hand, would be considered a threat. But again, Natasha and Wanda don't have that special relationship. Um, then Wanda picks up the snow globe from a nearby shelf, threw it through the glass coffee table. This would, of course, be considered, a not a act of causing bodily injury, but a recklessly and putting her in fear of bodily injury and spraying glass everywhere. So this would definitely put Natasha in fear of bodily injury, and also would be destruction of Vision's personal property. So this would probably be the first act. Maybe barging through the front door would be considered an act of abuse against Vision as well, even though he wasn't there at the time. The fact that somebody broke into your home, and she didn't break in, but she entered without being invited, could also be considered an act of abuse against Vision. Also, if that's his coffee table, that could be considered an act of abuse against Vision. And then she leaves the apartment. She sees Vision's vehicle in the parking lot, and then she basically goes Carrie Underwood on it. She uses the pocket knife, gashes a hole in all four tires, and then left. So um, the obviously, again, this is destroying personal property. So she destroys all the tires on Vision's vehicle. This would be harassment, disturbing the peace, destroying personal property, all kinds of stuff that Vision could get a restraining order against Wanda for. And by the way, for anybody wondering, well, what can Natasha do in this circumstance? One of the most common applicants for civil harassment restraining orders are girlfriends against girlfriends, wives against girlfriends. It happens all the time because they do not qualify under those rules for a domestic violence restraining order. They have to use these other mechanisms. So a civil harassment restraining order, which again I said is harder to prove, but not impossible. I've gotten quite a few civil harassment restraining orders, but that's why it's one of the more common ones for girlfriends against girlfriends because, or boyfriends against boyfriends for that matter, but usually I see it the other gender. Um, Although I have seen it against boyfriends against husbands and things like that, or boyfriends against ex-husbands, because you know they're involved in these things, but they don't have the right to ask for a domestic violence restraining order. So um, while obviously what Wanda did was completely wrong, you will find most judges, not all, but most judges are try to be understanding of the circumstances of the what was going on. And so I have had enough, and again, I like I said, I take these stories from my practice, from things that I go through in my practice. And what I'll say is that uh, when something like this happens with one of my clients, what I typically do is say, I'll try to get the other side to agree to something that, my client's probably not going to like, but she's already done so much. There's obviously going to be a restraining order. So we try to come to an agreement. But also, what I would might have them do, might not always, but might have them do is go ahead and get on the stand and admit to what you did, but beg the court's forgiveness and understanding of why you did it. And let's show the court what kind of man vision what really was in this circumstance. So you can, there'll definitely be some sympathy there. And the reason for that is restraining orders have, and we're going to get into this in later parts, but the duration of a restraining order is anywhere from a day to 5 years in California. A domestic violence restraining order. Civil harassment restraining orders, the maximum is 3 years. But a domestic violence restraining order you can request one for up to 5 years. And so, what I would hope in a circumstance like this, if the proof is pretty significant against Wanda, what we would typically do is, you know, uh, beg the court's forgiveness and hope that the court, looking at all these things, will then give Wanda a restraining order that is not 5 years, but maybe 1 year. And then things can, hopefully there's enough of a cooling off period that things resolve and everybody can move on. So, but those are acts of domestic violence though, and they do happen. Like I said, these are all taken out of cases that I've had. So next time we're going to talk about the actual procedure for requesting a restraining order. So the papers and showing up to your hearing and the trial. And then on the third part, I'm going to walk everyone through the whole application process, the request for a domestic violence restraining order, what that application should look like, and how to fill it out. And then we'll talk about how to prepare for court so you can prove your case. And we'll also talk about for people defending against restraining orders, how they might want to go about doing that as well, and how finally we'll talk about some of the effects that getting a restraining order, having the court make a finding that abuse occurred, that kind of effect on your family, what kind of effect that might have on the rest of your family law case, if there is more of your family law case than just the domestic violence. So almost all my domestic violence cases involve children. So custody is almost always one of the issues, but not always. I just had a couple of cases last year where it involved romantic partners that did not yet have children, and actually three. I think I had three just came to mind right now that I had last year where that was the case, and thank God for them, right? That they didn't have those three didn't have children. So that's it for tonight, though. I really appreciate you tuning in. I'll try to get the rest of it. I don't have a timeline. I try to finish these when I do have time, the spare time from my practice to work on them, but I do enjoy doing it. I try to get the next presentation up soon so that you can have all the parts to look at and to plan for your domestic violence case. Until then, again, please visit us on TikTok and on Twitter, and have a great night.